Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
Hey, I'm Jer Stays, and welcome to your Daily Detroit for Tuesday, December 1st, 2020. On episode 644 of the podcast, we're getting into the recent developments with General Motors. Beyond being one of our region's largest employers, the company has a huge cultural impact here. It used to be said, what's good for GM is good for the nation. And even today, it still very much impacts Metro Detroit. Our guide for what's happening will be AutoTrader's Michelle Krebs. She's an expert I trust with years of experience. We'll talk about GM pulling out of a lawsuit against the state of California on emissions, their plans for an all-electric vehicle portfolio, and the dead deal to tie up with Nikola for an ownership stake. Then I'll share 3 quick things to know today and send you on your way. Let's just get started. Joining me on the line is Michelle Krebs. She is an analyst for AutoTrader. Welcome back to Daily Detroit.
Thank you for having me back.
Absolutely. Today's episode, I really want to focus on one company. I think it's important in the minds of, frankly, all Metro Detroiters and Michiganders. That's General Motors. There are 3 big stories I kind of wanted to get into. First off, and we had discussed getting together a little bit before the holiday weekend. So the first story I wanted to mention was that GM is actually abandoning the lawsuit from the Trump administration against California over emission standards. I feel like that's a kind of signal that things are really changing.
Well, yes, General Motors reversed course and decided it was not going to support the Trump administration's lawsuit against California. The administration was arguing that California couldn't set its own emission standards. And of course, this all happened before the election. And then Joe Biden is elected and GM changes course. And for a good reason, because Joe Biden will be much friendlier to electric vehicles than the Trump administration was. And, GM's betting a lot of money on EVs being the future. It was always a little bit of a puzzlement why GM supported that lawsuit, because they are so out in front and aggressive in terms of their plans for EVs of the future.
Publicly, GM CEO Mary Barra has been very supportive of Biden's approach to things.
Well, absolutely, because they need government support. One of the obstacles to EV adoption is charging infrastructure, and that definitely needs federal, state, support to build that infrastructure. That's not something GM can do alone or any automaker alone. To proliferate EVs and in volume so that GM can eventually make money on them, they definitely need some support. It's been useful to have incentives on EVs and plug-in hybrids and such. And GM has benefited from that, although they've run out of those. And there's a possibility that those could be continued or the lid taken off. If an automaker hits 200,000 units of sales of those vehicles, those incentives no longer apply. So it's possible that those could be part of a package.
A lot of folks talk about electric cars, and one of the keys to this is increasing that electric charging infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely. It's sort of a patchwork thing. And you'll see more in California, you see more on the East Coast, but what people want to be able to do is drive long distances and know that they can top off charging just as they would their gas cars. And you really can't do that, especially here in the Midwest yet.
Well, full disclosure, I'm driving around a Volt, and I tried to charge it the other day at a parking garage when I was running an errand, and I didn't have the right kind of card to match that charger. And that was really frustrating. I mean, if I could have just used a regular credit card, I would have been fine. But each individual charging station has its own provider, which is kind of crazy.
Right. And if you look at Tesla, it has its own kind of charger, period. So there needs to be some coordination on proliferating an EV charging infrastructure that applies to all EVs and plug-in hybrids.
Well, you were talking about that EV investment. One of the things that General Motors has recently talked about, just in the middle of November, was that 30 new global EV launches are planned through 2025, and that they're going to be doing more than $27 billion in electric EV and AV product spending. It's going to be bigger than their gas and diesel investment. It seems like this is an all-in step for electric for General Motors.
Yes, it is. General Motors and Volkswagen both are all in. it's a big bet. Other automakers, Toyota, Ford, are kind of hedging their bets. They're doing EVs, but they're doing hybrids and they're doing plug-in hybrids. But GM's all in on EVs. And as you said, CEO Mary Barra told a Barclays investment conference just before the holiday that it was upping its EV investment by more than a third. As you said, GM will spend $27 billion through 2025 to develop EVs and autonomous vehicles. And in March, that number had been at $20 billion, so they really upped it. They're talking about doing at least 30 EVs globally through 2025, and that includes 20 in North America. If you consider where they are now, they only have one EV, that being the Chevrolet Bolt that's on the market. So GM says by the end of 2025, 40% of its product line will be EVs. So it's very aggressive. The other thing that Barra told the conference is that they would be accelerating production timelines on some of them that we already know about, things like the GMC Hummer EV, the Cadillac Lyriq, because they've learned how to make them faster, or develop them faster. And also a lot of progress on batteries, cost of batteries, and range of batteries that she shared some information on. That's key. That we've got to have batteries that the cost comes down to be more equivalent to a gasoline engine and that go as far.
Right. So that gets me to two ideas. I think number one, I feel like there's going to be a lot of knock-on effects to have these very large automakers bet so heavy into electric throughout like the supply chain system, throughout even the service system. I mean, servicing an electric vehicle is different than serving a gas-powered vehicle and all of that. There could be a lot of reverberations, right?
Oh, absolutely. Let's start with the supply chain itself. There isn't enough battery production in the world to accommodate, some of the aggressive plans yet. Now that there's a lot being built. The other thing I think we have to look at is China is building most of the batteries. Europe is scampering to build some battery production. We don't have as much here in the U.S., so that's something that's going to have to be focused on. GM is building a joint venture plant in Ohio with LG Chem, its supplier, so it's coming on. But even before the battery, you have to think about the elements that go into batteries, things like lithium and cobalt, and where do those come from? Some of them don't come from very nice places, keeping the supply of that going as well. And there's a lot of work going on in terms of developing battery chemistries that don't use as much of those minerals.
Right. And what do you think the GM executives are thinking with this transition? You mentioned that Ford was kind of hedging and doing both and hybrids and things like that. What is the calculation that GM executives are making in kind of going all in on this? And why do you think they're doing it?
Well, I think some of it has to do with the fact that they're huge in China. GM and Volkswagen are the biggest Western companies doing business in China, and China has regulated that, there will be more electric vehicles because of their pollution issues. So I think, being there in China, they see that as the future, and it is the biggest EV market now, and it, will be going forward. Interestingly, Europe is right behind China, and GM really isn't playing there, which makes me wonder if maybe GM will go in at some point with a different strategy with purely EVs in Europe. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but it's a big market. So the U.S. is really lagging China and Europe. I think we're at like 2% of all the new vehicles sold are electric vehicles, and half of that's Tesla. So we're way behind.
Finally, I kind of wanted to end this conversation in that GM has pulled out of the deal with electric truck startup Nikola. There's a lot of high profile Nikola kind of fell flat on their face a little bit with some stuff publicly on a couple of different levels. So it looks like GM is pulling out of that. And then also there will be no more development of the fuel cell Badger pickup truck. Is this specialty use of electric vehicles kind of a way of the future before there's general adoption? And what are the thoughts on that? I think a lot of people were surprised that GM stood by Nikola for so long.
Let's go back even further. GM desperately wanted to invest in Rivian. They lost that deal to Ford. With full disclosure, Cox Automotive, the company I work for, also invested in Rivian. So I think GM was looking for an entrepreneurial partner to move forward with, and Nikola was there. And it was an interesting deal. They really weren't putting pure cash into it. They were going to help with fuel cells and with building this Badger vehicle. But then, Nikola had all kinds of problems with being accused of fraud and that kind of thing. And that's, because lawsuits and investigations take a while, that likely will linger on. And so GM yesterday, I think it was, scaled back. It's still involved with the company, but it's not to the degree that it was, and they will not be building their vehicle.
One of the things I've seen with Rivian is that the idea that they're going to be doing that skateboard for all of these, developments, and then the Amazon vehicles. And then, Nikola's idea is the semi trucks. And then, in fact, Ford recently had a whole thing about their electric vehicle vans for fleets. Is that kind of the beginning of like the electric transformation in this country where we don't have as much adoption as those two other markets that you were talking about?
Well, two things. I think I was just remarking to someone not too long ago that I remember when General Motors introduced a skateboard concept years ago. I can't even remember what year, at the Detroit Auto Show. They used it on, I want to say, a Pontiac Trans Am or Firebird or something like that. It was a sports vehicle, and it was the identical idea that we're seeing of the skateboard concept, where you have the batteries and the wheels, and then you put different tops on them. So it's kind of interesting that GM had this idea long ago, and here it comes back again, which is something we often see. But yes, I have always thought that the quick and smart way to EV adoption is to put them in fleets. And that's exactly what we're seeing from some of these companies, fuel cells and electric vehicles. If you put them in fleets like delivery vehicles, and by the way, the delivery business is booming as a result of the pandemic, and there's actually a shortage of vehicles. Those vehicles, they have a very predictable pattern, and that allows the placement of charging infrastructure to get these things off the ground, and also allows a lot of study and data gathering for how they behave, the maintenance schedules, what does need to be maintained at what intervals. They can do a lot of work that I think it would be really important. So I expect that EVs will be mostly in fleets. If you think about power companies are starting to put EVs and such into their fleets. So I think that's the way to proliferate it. The other thing about that is those are big numbers of vehicles and have the biggest impact in terms of emissions versus the one-off to every individual buyers.
So I guess I'll kind of land here with, is there kind of an idea in the industry or a feeling around when this transition to electric is going to be more fully happening across the entire spectrum? Or are we just not sure yet?
Oh, I think we're not sure yet. It's hard to say. If we're at 2% of EVs right now, of new vehicle sales, is it going to be 5% or 10% by 2025? It's really hard to say. And a lot of it will depend on the consumer, be that the business consumer or the individual consumer. We have, 300 million vehicles on the road today. Those aren't going away overnight, and they last a long time because of the much better quality. So it's really hard to say when the tipping point will be, but I don't think it'll be in the next few years.
Well, Michelle Krebs, she is an analyst for AutoTrader. Thank you so much for being generous with your time today, and appreciate you.
Thank you.
Here are 3 other things to know today. It looks like Detroit is getting another business headquarters and manufacturing facility. This time it's Sharrow Marine, a company that sells propellers along with nautical and aeronautical technology. The company is headed up by Greg Sharrow. He's from the Detroit area and says that Detroit will become the new home base for their manufacturing, customer service, and engineering operations. Detroit, being on the water, has had a long history of working with boats, and that's kind of declined in recent decades. But back in the day, one of Henry Ford's jobs before he started Ford Motor Company was working at a ship construction yard. The building is now the DNR Resource Center near Milliken State Park. Anyhow, the number of jobs tied to the Sharrow project has not been announced, but it's neat to see a homecoming of sorts. The company had been based in Philadelphia. A pilot program that tests sewer systems for signs of COVID-19 has been expanded with a $800,000 grant to cover 7 Metro Detroit cities. What scientists have found is that monitoring wastewater can be an early indicator for the presence of a disease in the community. It gives officials between 1 and 2 weeks of warning before critical illnesses show up at hospitals or are reported. In the past, the technology has been used to help track widespread drug use, alcohol abuse, polio outbreaks, and more. 9 zip codes in high-spread areas have been selected, with 3 in Detroit and 1 each in East Point, Oak Park, Macomb Township, Southfield, Sterling Heights, and West Bloomfield Township. And finally, the Michigan State Senate held a hearing Tuesday around alleged issues with absentee ballots at the TCF Center in Detroit during the November election. I followed it myself, but I think what best sums up the affair is a tweet from Gongwer reporter Nick Smith. You can find him at nsmithreports. And if you don't know, Gongwer is a nonpartisan outlet, and it's been covering the state capitol for years. Quote, "We're at the 2.5-hour mark, and not a single person who has testified has said anything beyond items that have to date been largely disproven in court or through reporting," unquote. There are some things where there are not both sides. As Neil deGrasse Tyson would say, there are three truths: personal truths, political truths, and objective truths. Using that method, I'll say there was no widespread, in fact, almost no voter fraud in 2020. Well, that's an objective truth, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks to our newest member, Nikki, who joined us at patreon.com/dailydetroit. You are awesome. Stickers are on the way. Also, thanks to all of our members. It's so critical right now, and it's literally what's paying the bills to keep this project going. And so thank you very much. You all are very generous. We're working on some great segments, literally have 7 interviews booked over the next few days, and always open to your ideas at dailydetroit@gmail.com. Also, if you want to leave a voicemail, 313-789-3211. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and I'll see you around Detroit. Talk tomorrow.